When he came back home after 2 years abroad, he expected a joyful reunion with his mother. But when he saw her in the garden, dressed in worn-out clothes and sweeping the ground like a servant, his heart shattered. The woman who once lived in his mansion was now forced to sleep in a small broken hut and survive on leftovers. In that moment, he realized the person he trusted the most had been hiding a cruel betrayal. Hello fam, welcome to True Love Stories, where we share interesting and intriguing stories. Please do well to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Do not forget to like and share with your loved ones. Now let's dive into the story. For 2 long years, Ethan Caldwell had lived thousands of miles away from home, building a powerful business empire that quickly captured global attention. At just 32 years old, he had taken a risky technology venture overseas and turned it into a thriving international company. The project had originally been planned to last 5 years, and when he first left, everyone, including his family, expected he would be gone for a long time. But Ethan was relentless and brilliant in business. Opportunities unfolded faster than anyone predicted, deals closed ahead of schedule, and the company's growth exceeded expectations. By the end of the second year, the project had already surpassed its original goals. Instead of announcing his return, Ethan decided to make it a surprise. He imagined the happiness it would bring to the people he loved most, especially his mother, Margaret Caldwell. She had always been his greatest supporter and the person who believed in him long before success ever found him. When Ethan first told her about the opportunity abroad, she had encouraged him to go without hesitation, even though it meant being apart for years. "Your future matters more than anything," she had said gently, squeezing his hand. "Don't worry about me. Go build the life you deserve." It was also Margaret who had insisted that Ethan postpone his wedding to his fiancée, Vanessa Whitmore. Vanessa had been eager to marry immediately, but Margaret believed Ethan should focus on his career first. Marriage, she believed, should begin when both partners had the time and stability to build a real life together. Ethan had trusted his mother's wisdom and agreed to wait until he returned from his overseas work. Vanessa had smiled at the time, but deep down she had never liked the decision. As Ethan's car rolled through the large iron gates of his estate that afternoon, he felt a mixture of excitement and peace. The mansion stood tall and elegant, just as he remembered it. White stone walls, tall windows reflecting the sunlight, and perfectly trimmed gardens stretching across the property. This house had once been filled with warmth, laughter, and the comforting presence of his mother. But as Ethan stepped out of the car, a strange feeling crept over him. Something about the atmosphere felt different. The air seemed unusually quiet, almost tense. There were no signs of the welcoming energy he expected. Normally, the household staff would greet him or at least be moving around the property. Today, the grounds seemed strangely empty. Ethan decided to walk through the garden before entering the mansion. The fresh air would calm his mind before the emotional reunion he had been waiting for. As he followed the stone pathway deeper into the garden, he noticed something that made him slow his steps. At the far end of the property stood a small wooden structure he had never seen before. It looked old, fragile, and completely out of place among the luxurious landscape. The wood was faded and cracked, and the roof looked as though it had been patched together with cheap materials. It resembled a storage shed more than a place someone would live. Ethan frowned in confusion, wondering why something like that had been built on his property. Then he heard the soft scraping sound of a broom against the stone path. His eyes shifted toward the garden walkway, and what he saw next made his heart drop. An elderly woman stood there slowly sweeping fallen leaves. Her clothes were worn and dusty, hanging loosely from her thin frame. Her hair, once neatly kept, was now messy and streaked with gray. The posture of her body looked tired, as though every movement required effort. For a moment, Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman lifted her head slightly, wiping sweat from her forehead with the edge of her sleeve. When the sunlight touched her face, Ethan felt a sharp pain pierce through his chest. It was his mother, Margaret Caldwell, the woman who had once lived comfortably inside the grand mansion, was now standing in the garden looking exhausted, dressed like someone who had been doing hard labor all day. Her hands, which had once been soft and gentle, now looked rough and worn. Ethan felt the world around him go silent. The joy he had carried all the way home suddenly shattered into confusion and disbelief. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why was his mother outside doing chores? Why was she dressed like that? And what was that broken hut doing in the garden behind her? A heavy ache formed in his chest as he continued watching her quietly work, unaware that her son had returned. In that moment, Ethan realized something was terribly wrong. And whatever the truth was, it was about to break his heart. "Mom!" The word slipped from Ethan's lips almost like a whisper, but in the quiet garden it sounded loud enough to stop the world. Margaret froze instantly. The broom in her hands paused mid-sweep. For a moment she stood completely still, as if she had just heard something impossible. Slowly she turned around. Her tired eyes widened. "Ethan?" she said softly, her voice trembling with disbelief. For a few seconds neither of them moved. It felt as though time itself had stopped between them. Margaret stared at her son, as if she were looking at a dream she was afraid might disappear. Then the broom slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. "Ethan!" she cried. Before she could say anything else, Ethan rushed toward her. In seconds he had wrapped his arms tightly around her fragile frame. The hug was filled with relief, love, and a deep pain he couldn't yet put into words. Margaret held him just as tightly. my son, you're home," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. But as Ethan held her, his heart grew heavier. Something felt terribly wrong. His mother's body felt lighter than he remembered, almost frail. Her clothes were rough and dusty, and her hands felt calloused and dry against his back. He gently pulled away and looked at her carefully. Her face had changed. There were deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and her skin looked pale from long days under the sun. This wasn't how his mother had looked 2 years ago. "Mom, what happened?" he asked quietly. Margaret quickly tried to force a smile. "Oh, nothing happened," she said softly, brushing dust off her skirt as if it were nothing important. "I just help around the garden sometimes. It keeps me busy." But Ethan wasn't convinced. His eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the small hut behind her. The door was slightly open. Inside, he could see a thin mattress on the floor, a small wooden chair, and a tiny table with a metal plate and cup. The room looked cold and empty, more like a storage shed than a place where someone should live. A painful realization began to form in his mind. "Mom," Ethan said slowly, his voice tightening, "do you live in there?" Margaret hesitated. For a moment she didn't answer. Her silence was enough. Ethan's chest tightened with anger and disbelief. "Why aren't you inside the mansion?" he asked. Margaret looked down at the ground, nervously rubbing her hands together. "Well, Vanessa said the house needed some changes and renovations," she explained gently. "She told me it would only be temporary for me to stay here." Ethan felt his fists slowly clench. "Temporary," he repeated. Margaret nodded, trying to keep the situation from sounding worse than it was. She said she didn't want construction noise disturbing me. "And I actually like the garden air," she added quickly, as though trying to convince him. But Ethan could hear the weakness in her explanation. He looked again at the small hut, the worn broom, and the rough dirt around her feet. "Mom, how long have you been staying here?" he asked quietly. Margaret hesitated again. "Since a few months after you left," she admitted softly. The word struck Ethan like a blow. Almost 2 years. For 2 entire years his mother had been living like this. He struggled to keep his emotions under control. "And food?" he asked carefully. "You eat inside the house, right?" Margaret avoided his eyes. "I usually eat after everyone else finishes," she said quietly. "It's easier that way." Ethan felt his heart shatter. The woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him had been treated like a burden in her own home. Suddenly, the guilt became unbearable. Ethan dropped to his knees right there on the garden path. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Margaret exclaimed in shock. But he didn't move. Tears filled his eyes as he held her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I trusted the wrong person. I left you here thinking you were safe, thinking you were being taken care of. Margaret quickly tried to lift him up. No, no, my son, she said softly. Don't blame yourself. You were working hard for your future. That's what matters. But Ethan shook his head. No, he said firmly. He stood up slowly and wiped his eyes, but the sadness in them had now turned into something stronger. Anger. He gently placed his arm around his mother's shoulders. You're not staying here another minute, he said. Margaret looked confused. But Ethan, where will we? We're leaving, he interrupted calmly. He picked up the small bag of belongings she kept inside the hut. Just a few clothes and personal items. The sight of how little she owned only made his determination stronger. As they walked toward his car, Ethan took one last look at the mansion. What once felt like home now felt like a place built on lies. And inside that mansion was the person responsible for everything his mother had suffered. Vanessa Whitmore had no idea what was coming, but she would soon find out. Ethan drove away from the estate without looking back. His mother sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded gently in her lap. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a heavy mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and disbelief. Margaret kept glancing at her son, as if she still couldn't believe he was truly there. You didn't tell anyone you were coming back? She asked softly. Ethan shook his head. I wanted it to be a surprise, he replied. He forced a small smile, but the pain behind it was obvious. The surprise he had imagined, a joyful reunion, laughter, and warm hugs, had turned into something completely different. Within 20 minutes, Ethan pulled up in front of one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. The tall glass building reflected the evening sunlight, and uniformed staff stood by the entrance ready to welcome guests. Margaret looked at the place nervously. Ethan, this place looks expensive, she said quietly. Ethan stepped out of the car and opened the door for her. You deserve the best, Mom, he said gently. Inside the hotel, the staff immediately recognized Ethan Caldwell. News of his international business success had spread widely, and many people in the city knew his name. The hotel manager personally greeted him. Mr. Caldwell, welcome back. It's an honor to have you here, the manager said respectfully. Ethan nodded politely. I'd like the presidential suite prepared immediately, he said. Within minutes, Margaret was escorted to a beautiful suite overlooking the city skyline. The room was warm, elegant, and peaceful. Nothing like the cold little hut she had been living in. Fresh clothes were delivered for her. A warm meal was prepared. Even a doctor was arranged to check on her health. Margaret sat on the soft couch, still overwhelmed by everything happening so quickly. You really didn't have to do all this, she said softly. Ethan sat beside her. I should have done more, he replied quietly. That night, for the first time in a long while, Margaret slept comfortably in a real bed. The exhaustion of the past 2 years finally caught up with her, and she drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. But Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the large window looking out over the city lights. His mind kept replaying the image of his mother sweeping the garden, wearing worn-out clothes, living in that tiny hut. The anger inside him grew stronger with every thought. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa Whitmore was completely unaware that everything was about to change. She was sitting at an elegant rooftop restaurant with a group of her friends. The table was filled with expensive dishes, sparkling drinks, and laughter. Vanessa leaned back proudly in her chair, showing off a designer handbag resting beside her. My fiancé just closed another massive deal overseas, she said smugly. Honestly, I don't even know what to do with all the money sometimes. Her friends admired her glamorous lifestyle. You're so lucky, one of them said. Living in that huge mansion must feel like a dream. Vanessa smiled arrogantly. It really is, she replied. And I practically run the entire estate. Another friend asked casually, what about Ethan's mother? Doesn't she live there too? Vanessa rolled her eyes slightly before covering it with a fake smile. Oh, Margaret? She's doing fine, Vanessa said dismissively. I make sure she's taken care of. Her friends nodded, impressed by what they believed was her kindness. But none of them knew the truth. Vanessa had been living a life of luxury using Ethan's wealth. She spent money on designer clothes, international shopping trips, private parties, and expensive vacations with friends. Every time Ethan called from abroad, she played the role of a caring future daughter-in-law. "Oh, Margaret is doing wonderful," she would say sweetly over the phone. "Don't worry about anything. I'm taking great care of her." Ethan had trusted her completely. Later that evening, Vanessa returned home to the mansion after her lavish dinner. The house was quiet as usual. She stepped out of her car and walked toward the entrance when something suddenly caught her attention. The garden. She frowned. The small hut where Margaret stayed looked unusually dark. Vanessa walked closer, irritation already forming on her face. "Margaret," she called impatiently. No response. She pushed the door open. The hut was empty. Vanessa's expression turned into anger. "Where did that old woman go now?" she muttered. She stormed toward the mansion, calling out to one of the house staff. "Did anyone see Margaret leave?" she demanded. The staff members looked confused and shook their heads. Vanessa scoffed, annoyed. "Unbelievable," she said under her breath. But just as she turned toward the grand staircase, the massive front doors of the mansion slowly opened. The sound echoed through the silent hall. Vanessa turned around. The moment she saw who was standing in the doorway, all the color drained from her face. Ethan Caldwell had returned, and the calm expression on his face made it clear that he already knew everything. The heavy wooden doors of the mansion slowly closed behind Ethan, the sound echoing through the grand hall like a warning. Vanessa stood frozen in the middle of the room. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things. Ethan wasn't supposed to return for another 3 years. Her heart began racing as panic crept into her chest. "Ethan," she said, forcing a surprised smile onto her face. "Oh my goodness." She quickly walked toward him, pretending to be excited. "You're back already? Why didn't you tell me?" she said with exaggerated joy. "I would have planned something special to welcome you home." She reached out as if to hug him. But Ethan didn't move. His expression was cold and distant. The warmth she was used to seeing in his eyes had completely disappeared. Vanessa slowly lowered her arms, feeling uneasy. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to sound innocent. Ethan looked around the mansion silently. Everything inside the house looked more luxurious than he remembered. Expensive decorations, new furniture, and large paintings filled the hall. It was clear Vanessa had been spending money freely. Finally, Ethan's eyes returned to her. "Where is my mother's room?" he asked calmly. Vanessa blinked. "My what?" "My mother's room," Ethan repeated, his voice steady but firm. "The one she lives in inside this house." Vanessa let out a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, Margaret? She's fine," she said quickly. "You know how she is. She prefers the garden. She loves fresh air and gardening, so we made her a little place outside." Ethan stared at her silently. She continued talking, trying to sound convincing. "It was actually her idea," Vanessa added. "She said the mansion felt too big and quiet for her." "Enough." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Vanessa's smile faded. "I saw the hut," Ethan said slowly. Her stomach dropped. For the first time, real fear appeared in her eyes. "You made my mother live there," he continued, his voice low but filled with controlled anger. "For 2 years." Vanessa immediately shook her head. No, that's not what happened," she said quickly. "You're misunderstanding everything. She insisted on staying there. I tried to convince her to come inside, but she refused." Ethan took a step closer. His gaze was sharp and unshakable. "Did she also insist on eating leftovers?" he asked quietly. Vanessa froze. "Did she insist on sweeping the garden every day?" he continued. "Did she insist on wearing old clothes while you spent thousands on designer dresses?" Vanessa's face turned pale. "How do you know all that?" she asked weakly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I saw it with my own eyes." The room went completely silent. Vanessa quickly changed her tone, trying to regain control. "Ethan, listen," she said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "You just arrived. You must be tired. Let's sit down and talk about this calmly." He pulled his arm away. "Don't touch me." The coldness in his voice sent a chill through her. I trusted you, Ethan continued. For 2 years, every time I called, you told me my mother was safe. You said she was comfortable and well cared for. Vanessa tried to interrupt. I was taking care of her. Ethan shook his head slowly. I checked everything, he said. Vanessa felt her chest tighten. What do you mean? Ethan pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table beside them. Bank records, credit statements, travel bookings, party expenses, he said calmly. While my mother was living in a hut, you were flying to Paris, Dubai, and Monaco. Vanessa stared at the folder in shock. You investigated me? I verified the truth, Ethan replied. She suddenly dropped the innocent act. So what if I spent some money? She snapped. You're rich, Ethan. It's not like you can't afford it. Ethan looked at her in disbelief. My mother was treated like a servant in her own home, he said. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. She was always interfering in our relationship, she argued. She told you not to marry me before you left. She never liked me. Ethan's eyes darkened. So you punished her for that? Vanessa didn't answer. Her silence said everything. After a few seconds, Ethan took a deep breath and straightened his posture. The decision had already been made. Pack your things, he said coldly. Vanessa blinked in confusion. What? You're leaving this house tonight. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious. Vanessa quickly grabbed his arm again, desperation creeping into her voice. Ethan, please. We're engaged. You can't just throw me out over a misunderstanding. But Ethan's expression didn't change. This isn't a misunderstanding, he said. He gently removed her hand from his arm. It's the end. Vanessa felt the ground beneath her confidence begin to crumble. She still didn't realize that losing the mansion was only the beginning. Within the next hour, she would lose everything. Vanessa stared at Ethan as if she had just heard something impossible. You're joking, right? She said, letting out a nervous laugh. Ethan, stop being dramatic. We can talk about this. But Ethan's face remained completely serious. This is not a discussion, he said calmly. You have 1 hour to leave. The confidence Vanessa had always carried began to crack. She shook her head in disbelief. Leave? Leave where? This is my home too. Ethan walked to the large marble table in the center of the hall and placed a thin folder on it. No, he said firmly. It isn't. Vanessa frowned and slowly walked closer. What is this supposed to be? Legal documents, Ethan replied. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Inside were property records, financial statements, and ownership certificates. The mansion, Ethan continued, is under my name through Caldwell Holdings. The vehicles, the accounts, and every luxury item purchased over the last 2 years were paid for by company funds. Vanessa looked up at him, confused. So what? I'm your fiancé. Ethan shook his head. Not anymore. The words hit her like a slap. And since we never got married, he continued calmly, you have no legal claim to anything here. Vanessa's breathing became heavier. You're bluffing, she said weakly. You wouldn't humiliate me like this. Ethan nodded toward the security guards who had quietly appeared near the entrance. I already have. Vanessa's anger exploded. This is ridiculous, she shouted. After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me? Ethan looked at her with disbelief. What exactly have you done for me? He asked coldly. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find an answer. Instead, she stormed upstairs toward the bedroom she had been using. If you want me gone, fine, she shouted. But I'm taking my things. Ethan followed her calmly. When she entered the room, she immediately began grabbing her expensive designer bags from the closet. But before she could take them, Ethan spoke again. Those stay. Vanessa turned around sharply. What do you mean those stay? They're mine. No, Ethan replied. They were purchased using my company cards. She grabbed one of the bags defensively. You gave them to me, and now I'm taking them back. Vanessa's face twisted with panic. She rushed to the wardrobe and pulled out dresses, shoes, and jewelry. Then I'm taking my clothes. Ethan crossed his arms. Anything purchased with company funds stays here. Her hands started shaking. Almost everything in the closet had been bought with Ethan's money. What about my jewelry? She asked, her voice growing desperate. Also purchased through my accounts. Vanessa felt as if the walls were closing in around her. For 2 years she had lived like royalty, luxury vacations, endless shopping, glamorous parties with friends who admired her lifestyle. Now, in a matter of minutes, everything was slipping away. This is insane, she cried. You can't leave me with nothing. Ethan looked at her coldly. My mother had nothing for 2 years. Those words silenced her. Security soon arrived upstairs. You may pack personal belongings that you owned before living here, one of them said firmly. You have 30 minutes remaining. Vanessa frantically searched through her things, but there was very little she could actually claim. In the end, she was left with a small suitcase containing a few basic outfits and personal items she had owned before meeting Ethan. The same woman who once carried dozens of luxury bags was now walking out of the mansion with a single suitcase. As the security guards escorted her to the front gate, Vanessa turned back one last time. You'll regret this, she shouted angrily. But Ethan didn't respond. He simply watched as the gates slowly closed behind her. Within days, the story spread among their social circle. People who once attended Vanessa's lavish parties began whispering about her downfall. The expensive trips, the designer outfits, the arrogance she had shown toward others. All of it suddenly became a source of gossip. Without Ethan's wealth, Vanessa's glamorous life collapsed quickly. Her so-called friends stopped calling. The luxury apartments and exclusive clubs she once visited were now out of reach. Whenever she saw people who remembered her from before, she lowered her head and walked away quickly. She was ashamed to face the same people she had once looked down on. Meanwhile, inside the mansion she had lost, Ethan stood quietly in the empty hall. For the first time in 2 years, the house felt peaceful again. But the most important thing to him wasn't the mansion. It was making sure his mother would never suffer like that again. After Vanessa left the mansion, the house became unusually quiet. The loud parties, endless shopping deliveries, and constant noise that once filled the halls had disappeared overnight. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. But the mansion no longer felt like home to him. Every corner reminded him of the pain his mother had endured there. The garden path where she had swept leaves, the small hut that still stood at the edge of the property, and the lies that had filled the house for 2 long years made it impossible for Ethan to stay. The next morning, he drove to the hotel to see his mother. Margaret was sitting near the large window of the suite, enjoying the warm sunlight while sipping a cup of tea. When Ethan walked in, she greeted him with a gentle smile. You look like you didn't sleep much, she said softly. Ethan sat across from her and sighed. I didn't, he admitted. Margaret studied his face for a moment. What happened with Vanessa? She asked carefully. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It's over, he said simply. Margaret was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. I see. There was no celebration in her reaction, only quiet understanding. She had always hoped things would work out peacefully, but deep down she had known Vanessa never truly cared for their family. What matters now, Ethan continued, is that you never have to go through something like that again. Margaret reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. My son, I'm already happy just knowing you're home. But Ethan had already made up his mind. Over the next few weeks, he began making big changes. The old mansion was sold along with most of the unnecessary luxury items that reminded him of the past. Instead, Ethan purchased a beautiful estate overlooking the ocean, far from the stressful environment of the city. The new house was elegant but peaceful, surrounded by green gardens, tall trees, and the calming sound of waves nearby. It was the kind of place where someone could truly feel at home. But the most important detail was something Ethan arranged quietly with his lawyers. The entire property was placed under Margaret Caldwell's name. When he handed her the documents, she looked at them in confusion. What is this? She asked. It's your house, Ethan said with a warm smile. Margaret's eyes widened. No, Ethan, this belongs to you. He shook his head. It belongs to the woman who sacrificed everything so I could succeed. Tears slowly filled her eyes. You've already done so much for me, she said softly. Ethan gently squeezed her hand. You raised me, supported me, and believed in me when I had nothing, he replied. This is the least I can do. Margaret moved into the new home a few days later. Her life slowly returned to the comfort and dignity she once had. She spent her mornings walking through the gardens, sometimes tending to flowers simply because she enjoyed it, not because she was forced to work. In the afternoons, she would sit by the ocean, reading books or preparing meals for Ethan when he returned from work. For the first time in years, her laughter returned to the house. Meanwhile, Vanessa's life continued to move in the opposite direction. Without Ethan's wealth, she quickly discovered that the glamorous lifestyle she once enjoyed was impossible to maintain. The friends who had once surrounded her disappeared one by one. Invitations to parties stopped. The luxury boutiques she used to visit were now places she avoided. Whenever she crossed paths with people who remembered how arrogantly she had behaved during her wealthy days, she felt overwhelming shame. Many of them whispered behind her back. The designer clothes and bags she once showed off were gone. Even the confidence she once carried had faded. Vanessa often kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with others. The life she once believed would last forever had vanished completely. But far away from that bitterness, Ethan and Margaret had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. Peace. One evening, as the sun slowly set over the ocean, Ethan and his mother sat together on the balcony of their new home. The sky was painted with beautiful shades of orange and gold, reflecting across the calm water. Margaret looked at her son with pride. You've become a very good man, she said gently. Ethan smiled and looked out at the horizon. No, he replied softly. I just followed what you taught me. Margaret squeezed his hand warmly. And as the sun disappeared into the sea, mother and son sat peacefully together, finally living the happy life they both deserved. Finally, we have come to the end of this story. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, do well to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.